A racist neighbor called the police to the wedding, and the police responded with brutal beatings of women and children and arrests. But when the identities of the bride and groom were established, their actions led to unexpected consequences. Will the newlyweds be able to achieve justice? Subscribe so as not to miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods of the city. The garden behind the elegant house was filled with the joyous laughter of family and friends. Flowers were carefully arranged, their sweet scent mingling with the aroma of gourmet dishes prepared for the wedding feast. Every detail had been meticulously planned by Jason, a successful FBI agent, and Lisa, a well-respected judge. Today was their wedding day, a day meant to celebrate their love and commitment to each other. Guests from all walks of life, including colleagues from the FBI, fellow judges, and close family members, were gathered to celebrate this momentous occasion. The mood was light, filled with happiness and excitement, as everyone raised their glasses to toast the couple's union. Children ran around, playing tag in the yard, while adults enjoyed pleasant conversations under the large white canopy set up to provide shade from the warm sun. Jason, tall and composed in his tailored tuxedo, stood with Lisa, radiant in her elegant white dress, at the center of attention. Their eyes sparkled with happiness as they thanked their guests for attending, making sure to greet everyone personally. The couple's connection was clear, their love evident in every glance and smile they exchanged. As the wedding festivities continued, no one could have predicted that something dark was brewing just beyond the high, white fence that surrounded their beautiful home. Living next door was an elderly man, Mr. Roberts, who had always kept to himself. He was known to be a recluse, rarely engaging with anyone in the neighborhood. Over the years, he had become more bitter and resentful, his views shaped by an ugly strain of racism. To him, seeing a black couple enjoying such success and celebration was a personal affront. From his living room window, Mr. Roberts watched the wedding unfold, his face twisted in disgust. He couldn't understand how people like Jason and Lisa, a black man and woman, could live in such a fine neighborhood and host such an extravagant event. The laughter and joy coming from the yard next door only fueled his anger. He was certain that something suspicious was going on, that these people were involved in some sort of criminal activity. His mind raced with hateful thoughts as he imagined the worst. Roberts picked up his phone with trembling hands, dialing 911 with a sense of urgency. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity," he said, his voice low but intense. "There's a large gathering in my neighbor's yard. I don't know what they're planning, but it doesn't look right. They're up to something dangerous. You need to send someone right away." The dispatcher, not suspecting that the call was driven by racism, assured him that a police unit would be sent to investigate. Mr. Roberts hung up the phone, a smug smile spreading across his face as he imagined the scene that would soon unfold. Back at the wedding, the couple and their guests were unaware of the call that had just been made. They continued to enjoy the celebration, oblivious to the storm about to descend upon them. The joyful atmosphere was soon interrupted, however, when one of the guests noticed several police cars pulling up outside the house. "Why is the police here?" someone asked, their voice filled with confusion. Heads turned and murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Jason and Lisa exchanged a glance, both puzzled by the sudden presence of law enforcement. "I'll go see what's going on," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped away from the guests and approached the entrance to the yard where several police officers had gathered. Before he could say anything, the lead officer shouted, "Everyone stay where you are." His tone was harsh, and the officers quickly fanned out, surrounding the wedding party. The peaceful gathering turned tense as the police moved in with hands on their weapons. Jason raised his hands in a gesture of compliance, trying to reason with the officers. "Hold on. This is just a wedding. There's no need for this. I'm an agent with the FBI, and my wife is a judge. There's been some mistake." But the officers weren't listening. Instead, their suspicion had already been fueled by the false report from Mr. Roberts. They saw the diverse group of guests, the successful black couple, and their minds were clouded with prejudice. Without warning, they pushed Jason aside and started to forcefully round up the guests, ignoring their cries of protest. Lisa, horrified by what she was seeing, tried to intervene. "This is completely unjustified. You can't just come in here and treat people like this," she shouted, stepping forward to confront the officers. But they didn't listen to her either. "Get back," one of the officers barked, shoving her to the ground with unnecessary force. Panic spread among the guests as officers began dragging people away, pushing children, women, and elderly family members with no regard for their safety. The peaceful wedding had transformed into a scene of chaos, and no one understood why. Jason rushed to Lisa's side, helping her up while still pleading with the officers. "You don't understand. We're not criminals. This is a mistake." But their pleas fell on deaf ears. The last moments of the chapter described the scene intensifying, with the entire wedding party being thrown into confusion as police cars blocked the street and more officers swarmed the area. The first chapter ends with Jason and Lisa standing helpless as their dream day turns into a nightmare. The peaceful celebration had turned into a scene of unimaginable chaos within minutes. The police, ignoring all pleas and reasoning, descended upon the wedding like a swarm, their aggression unprovoked. They didn't hesitate. Their batons were drawn, and their eyes were filled with the cold detachment of those who had already decided on the guilt of the people before them. It was as though they had entered the home of hardened criminals, not a group of family and friends celebrating love. Jason stood in front of Lisa, trying to shield her from the violence unfolding around them. He shouted at the officers, his voice filled with a mixture of authority and disbelief. "Stop this. You're making a terrible mistake. I am an FBI agent and my wife is a judge. There's no reason for this." But his words were drowned out by the harsh commands and the sound of bodies hitting the ground. The officers, driven by the false report and their own ingrained prejudices, were not interested in explanations. They had arrived prepared for a conflict, and they would have one. With batons raised, they moved through the wedding party with terrifying force. Women, men, children, the elderly, no one was spared from the violent sweep. A young boy, no older than 10, had been playing near the garden when the chaos erupted. He stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror as an officer grabbed him by the arm and threw him to the ground as though he were a threat. His mother screamed, rushing to protect her son, but she too was met with brutality. The sight of a mother shielding her child seemed to provoke the officers even more, as they shoved her down, pinning her to the ground as her son cried out in fear. Nearby, an elderly couple, friends of Lisa's parents, were struggling to keep their balance as officers pushed them roughly aside. The woman stumbled, her frail frame collapsing onto the hard pavement. Her husband tried to help her up, but before he could reach her, a baton came down on his back, sending him crashing down beside her. There was no mercy, no pause to consider the humanity of those being beaten. Lisa, in her white wedding dress, watched in horror as her family and friends were brutally assaulted. Tears streamed down her face, not from fear for herself, but from the sheer helplessness she felt as she witnessed the violence unleashed upon the people she loved. She tried to intervene again, raising her voice over the chaos. "Please stop! You can't do this! We're not criminals! You're hurting innocent people!" But her words were met with silence. The officers continued their rampage as though her voice didn't exist. One officer turned to her, his face twisted with contempt. He approached her with deliberate steps, his hand gripping his baton tightly. Without warning, he swung at her, knocking her to the ground with a single, brutal strike. Jason's heart stopped as he saw his wife fall. "No!" Jason shouted, rushing towards her. But before he could reach her, two officers tackled him to the ground. They showed no regard for his claims of being a federal agent. In their eyes, he was just another target for their unchecked aggression. Pinned to the ground, Jason struggled to breathe as one officer pressed his knee into his back with crushing force. He tried again to explain, his voice strained. "I'm FBI. Please. This is wrong." But his words were ignored. The officer's knee dug deeper into his spine, and Jason could feel the bones in his body threatening to break under the pressure. His vision blurred as he caught glimpses of the chaos around him, women being dragged across the grass, children crying out in terror, and guests trying in vain to protect one another from the relentless brutality. Meanwhile, Lisa, still disoriented from the blow, struggled to get to her feet. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead, staining her once pristine wedding dress. She looked around, dazed, as officers continued to strike at the guests, their batons coming down again and again. One officer grabbed her by the arm, wrenching her to her feet. "You think you're above the law?" he sneered. "We know what you people are up to." Lisa's head swam from the pain, but she forced herself to speak, her voice hoarse. "I'm a judge. We haven't done anything wrong." The officer scoffed, pushing her back towards the group of arrested guests. "Yeah, right," he muttered, his grip on her arm tightening painfully. "You'll say anything to get out of this." Around her, the rest of the wedding party was rounded up and thrown into waiting police vans, treated no differently than dangerous criminals. Guests who had once been laughing and celebrating were now bruised, bloodied, and terrified. No one had been spared. Not the elderly, not the children, not even the bride and groom. Jason, still pinned to the ground, watched in horror as the police began loading his guests into the vans. He could hear their cries of confusion and pain, could see the looks of fear on their faces. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice breaking. "We're not criminals. We're not doing anything wrong." But again, no one listened. His words seemed to fall on deaf ears as he was roughly pulled to his feet and handcuffed. The officers dragged him towards the van where the rest of his guests were already being held. He could barely stand, his body aching from the repeated blows he had received. Lisa was thrown into the same van, her head resting against the cold metal wall, her eyes filled with disbelief and pain. As the last of the guests were loaded into the vans, an eerie silence fell over the scene. The once beautiful wedding was now nothing more than a battlefield, with shattered glasses and overturned chairs strewn across the yard. Bloodstains marked the ground where innocent people had been brutally beaten. The police vans pulled away from the house, carrying the wedding party to the station. Inside, Jason and Lisa sat among their guests, their hearts heavy with the weight of the violence they had just endured. They exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. They knew this was far from over. What had started as a joyful celebration had turned into a nightmare of brutality, but they were determined to fight back. The police vans roared through the city streets, carrying the bruised and bloodied wedding party toward the police station. Inside one of the vans, Jason sat with Lisa by his side, his arms still bound by the cold bite of handcuffs. Around them, guests sobbed quietly, some still in shock from the brutality they had just endured. Children huddled close to their parents, terrified and confused. The once joyous gathering was now reduced to a group of victims, all unjustly treated as criminals. Jason's mind raced as he replayed the events over and over. The sheer disbelief that this could happen, that police officers could descend upon a wedding and treat innocent people this way, left him reeling. He had always trusted the system, being part of law enforcement himself. But now, sitting here, he realized how quickly that system could turn on anyone, even someone like him, a federal agent. The anger began to build inside him, simmering beneath the surface. But there was one glimmer of hope that Jason hadn't counted on. Unbeknownst to the officers, one of the wedding guests had managed to record the entire incident on their phone. The footage captured everything, from the moment the police stormed in to the vicious beatings they unleashed on men, women, and children alike. It documented every punch, every shove, every desperate plea for mercy that had been ignored. That guest, a young woman named Sarah, had acted quickly. As soon as the police had begun their violent onslaught, she had taken out her phone, keeping it hidden as she recorded the horrifying events. She knew that the only way to fight back was to show the world what had happened, to expose the injustice in full. As she was loaded into the police van along with the others, she silently uploaded the video to her social media accounts. It didn't take long for the video to start gaining traction. Within minutes, people from all over the country were sharing it. The shocking footage of police officers beating innocent wedding guests was too horrific to ignore. The video spread like wildfire, first through the local community and then far beyond. Social media lit up with outrage as people watched in disbelief, unable to fathom how such brutality could be inflicted upon a group of people celebrating a wedding. Comments flooded in from users across the world. "This is disgusting. How can this happen in 2024? Those cops need to be held accountable immediately. How could they treat a wedding party like this? This is pure racism. The FBI needs to step in. This is a violation of civil rights." Within hours, the video had gone viral, reaching news outlets and media channels nationwide. Reporters scrambled to cover the story with headlines like "Police Brutality at Black Couple's Wedding," "Shocking Video Emerges," plastered across major news networks. The footage was played over and over, the disturbing images of children being torn from their parents and women being beaten flashing across screens everywhere. The media frenzy began to grow, fueled by the explosive nature of the video. Back in the police station, Jason, Lisa, and the wedding guests were being processed as criminals. Fingerprints were taken, mugshots snapped, and paperwork filled out, all without a single explanation from the officers about what charges were being filed. Jason's frustration mounted as he continued to plead with the officers. "You're making a mistake. I'm an agent with the FBI. My wife is a judge. You can't treat us like this." But again, his words fell on deaf ears. The officers seemed to relish their power over the group, treating them with disdain and arrogance. Jason felt his anger boiling over, but he kept himself calm for the sake of those around him. While they were being held in the cold, cramped cells of the police station, the world outside was erupting in outrage. News anchors debated the incident, legal experts dissected the video, and the public demanded answers. Protests began to form outside the police station, with signs reading "Justice for Jason and Lisa" and "Stop Police Brutality." People stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting for justice, for accountability, for the system to finally change. Inside, Jason had no idea what was happening beyond the walls of the police station. Hours passed with no communication, no acknowledgement of their demands for an explanation. All he knew was that the guests were tired, bruised, and scared. Lisa, her wedding dress still stained with blood, leaned against the cold wall of the cell, her eyes closed. The weight of what had happened pressed down on both of them, but the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. It wasn't until much later that night, when one of the senior officers came rushing into the station, that Jason began to realize something was shifting. The officer's face was pale, his expression tense. He quickly pulled aside one of the lower-ranking officers, whispering urgently. Jason strained to hear their conversation, but he couldn't make out the words. What he did notice, though, was the sudden change in the atmosphere. More officers started whispering to each other, their earlier confidence and smugness quickly evaporating. Jason could sense the fear creeping into their expressions. Something was happening. Something that none of them had anticipated. The senior officer finally stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously before addressing the group. Jason Matthews and Lisa Matthews?" he called out, his voice shaky. Jason stood up, helping Lisa to her feet as they moved toward the front of the cell. "That's us," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fatigue and pain in his body. There's been a misunderstanding," the officer stammered, unable to meet their eyes. We're going to release you both immediately. We've received some new information." Jason's eyes narrowed. "What kind of new information?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared to explain what had happened. "There's been a video. It's gone viral. We're still investigating the situation, but we understand there's been a mistake." A mistake? Jason thought. The word felt like a slap in the face. A mistake didn't begin to cover what had happened. He had watched his family and friends beaten, children terrorized, and his wife knocked to the ground on what was supposed to be their happiest day. This wasn't a mistake. It was a gross abuse of power, fueled by racism and prejudice. But for now, they had to get out of there. Jason nodded, biting back his anger as the officer opened the cell and led them out. Lisa walked beside him, silent but seething. As they stepped outside the station, they were met with the sight of hundreds of protesters all chanting their names, holding signs, and demanding justice. The world had seen what happened to them, and now it was time for the truth to come out. Jason and Lisa stood on the steps of the police station, looking out at the crowd, knowing that this fight wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been brutalized by a system that didn't value their lives. And now the whole world was watching. The pressure on the police department was mounting by the minute. The video of the brutal assault on Jason, Lisa, and their wedding guests had now reached every corner of the country, and protests were growing larger outside the police station. The public demanded accountability, and the once confident officers inside the station now felt the walls closing in. As the sun rose the next morning, Jason and Lisa were sitting at home with their attorney, going over the next steps. After their release from the police station, they had received overwhelming support from the community and national civil rights groups. The media had been relentless in exposing the injustice, and now it was time to hold those responsible accountable. Jason paced the room, his hands still shaking with the adrenaline of the last 24 hours. His mind replayed the events over and over. The moment the police stormed into their wedding, the beatings, the cries of his family and friends. It was a nightmare that had become all too real, and now the time for justice had come. "We need to make sure this doesn't just disappear," Jason said, his voice filled with determination. "I've seen too many cases like this. They'll try to cover it up, sweep it under the rug, and hope the public forgets. We can't let that happen." Lisa nodded in agreement, though her body still ached from the violence. She had been a judge for years, fighting for justice in the courtroom, but now she was the one seeking it. "We'll go public," she said, "press conferences, interviews, whatever it takes. They need to know who we are, that we're not just victims, but people with the power to expose them." Their attorney, a seasoned civil rights lawyer named Malcolm Green, leaned forward. "I've already filed a lawsuit against the police department," he said. "We're going to hit them hard, and we're going to make sure this case sets a precedent. Every officer involved is going to be held accountable, from the ones who beat you to the ones who turned a blind eye. This isn't just about you two. This is about the systemic abuse of power." Outside the house, the protests were still growing. People carried signs demanding justice for Jason and Lisa, but also for all the other victims of police brutality who had been ignored. The crowd chanted loudly, their voices echoing in the streets, "No justice, no peace." As the protests gained momentum, pressure on the police department intensified. The media was relentless, and investigative journalists began digging deeper into the actions of the officers involved in the attack. They uncovered a long history of complaints against some of the officers, excessive use of force, racial profiling, and even previous incidents of brutality that had been swept under the rug. This wasn't just an isolated event, it was part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. Inside the police station, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The officers who had once been so confident, so quick to unleash violence, were now nervous. They gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Many of them had seen the viral video, and they knew that their actions had been exposed for the world to see. The department's leadership was in full crisis mode. Meetings were held behind closed doors, with officials scrambling to contain the situation. But it was too late. The video had done more than just expose the brutality of the wedding raid. It had sparked a nationwide conversation about police accountability, racial injustice, and the abuse of power. The police chief, a man who had spent years defending his department against accusations of misconduct, now found himself at the center of a firestorm. In a hastily called press conference, he stood before a room full of reporters, his face grim as he read a prepared statement. "We take these allegations very seriously," the chief began, his voice heavy with tension. "The incident in question is currently under internal investigation, and we will cooperate fully with any external investigations as well. Let me be clear, we do not condone the use of excessive force, and any officers found to have violated department policy will be held accountable." But the public wasn't satisfied with words. They wanted action. And, as the press conference continued, the questions from the reporters became more pointed, more aggressive. "Chief, are you aware of the viral video that shows your officers beating women and children at a wedding? Can you confirm that one of the victims was an FBI agent and another a sitting judge? What do you have to say about the growing protests outside your station, demanding the resignation of the officers involved?" The chief struggled to maintain control. "As I said, this is an ongoing investigation, and I cannot comment on specifics at this time. he repeated, dodging the most direct questions, but it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, Jason and Lisa were preparing to face the media themselves. That afternoon, they held their own press conference, standing before a crowd of supporters and reporters. They were no longer just the victims of a violent attack. They were now the faces of a growing movement demanding justice. Jason stepped up to the microphone first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to us wasn't just an attack on me, my wife, or our family. It was an attack on all people of color who have been treated as less than human by a system that is supposed to protect them. I've worked in law enforcement for years, and I know there are good officers out there, but the system is broken. We were celebrating the happiest day of our lives, and in an instant, it was destroyed by hate, prejudice, and violence. We won't rest until every single officer responsible is held accountable. The crowd erupted into applause and chants of justice for Jason, justice for Lisa. Lisa spoke next, her voice filled with the calm authority she had cultivated over years as a judge. I have spent my career upholding the law, ensuring that justice is served fairly and impartially. But what happened to us shows that the law isn't applied equally to everyone. We were targeted because of the color of our skin. The officers didn't care that I was a judge or that my husband was an FBI agent. They saw us as criminals because of our race. That is the reality we face in this country, and that has to change. Their words were broadcast across the nation, and the public outcry only grew. News networks covered the story nonstop, with analysts discussing the implications of the police raid and its connection to the broader issue of police brutality in America. Civil rights organizations joined the call for justice, rallying behind Jason and Lisa as they became the new faces of the movement for police reform. The pressure on the police department was too great to ignore. Under intense scrutiny, the department was forced to take action. The officers involved in the raid were suspended, pending a full investigation. But that wasn't enough for the public. The protests continued, demanding that the officers be fired and charged with assault. Within days, the district attorney announced that several of the officers involved in the attack would face criminal charges, including assault and abuse of power. The police department, desperate to salvage its reputation, promised full cooperation with the investigation and fired the officers who had led the raid. But the fallout didn't stop there. The chief of police, whose leadership had come under intense criticism, was forced to resign. His legacy, once seen as strong and unwavering, was now tainted by scandal and failure. The department itself faced federal oversight as investigations into broader patterns of misconduct and racial bias were launched. The reckoning had begun, and it was clear that this incident would not be forgotten. Jason and Lisa had set the wheels of justice in motion, and the fight for accountability was far from over. The weight of the past few days bore heavily on Jason and Lisa, but the tide was finally turning. The protests had grown into a full-blown movement, with thousands of people across the country calling for justice, not only for them, but for all victims of police brutality. News outlets continued to cover the unfolding story, and social media was ablaze with outrage. The world was watching, and the truth was now impossible to ignore. As the public outcry reached its peak, legal actions against the police department and the officers involved escalated. The department, once confident in its ability to control the narrative, found itself drowning in lawsuits, federal investigations, and widespread condemnation. Jason and Lisa's case became the centerpiece of this reckoning, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. The morning of the court hearing had finally arrived. Jason, dressed in a dark suit, stood beside Lisa, who looked resolute in her professional attire. Despite the pain and trauma they had endured, they walked into the courtroom with their heads held high, determined to see this fight through to the end. The gallery was filled with supporters, civil rights activists, and media personnel, all eager to witness the outcome of a case that had captured the nation's attention. As they took their seats, they saw Mr. Roberts, their racist neighbor, sitting alone at the defense table. His face, once filled with smug hatred, was now pale and tense. The weight of his false accusations, which had sparked the police raid, had finally caught up to him. His lies had led to the brutalization of innocent people, and he was about to face the consequences. The judge entered the courtroom, and silence fell over the room. After months of investigations, protests, and mounting public pressure, the day of reckoning had come for Roberts and the officers responsible for the attack. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the case against him. The evidence was overwhelming. The 911 call he had made, falsely claiming that Jason and Lisa's wedding party was involved in suspicious activity, the racial slurs he had used, and his long history of harboring racist sentiments. But most damning of all was the viral video that had exposed the brutality unleashed upon the wedding party. The video had become the linchpin of the case, a powerful reminder of the violence sparked by one man's hatred. As the prosecutor played the footage once again for the court, the room filled with the sound of terrified screams and the sight of guests being dragged and beaten. The brutal actions of the police were impossible to ignore, and the role Roberts had played in orchestrating the raid became even clearer. Jason and Lisa sat quietly, their hands intertwined as they watched the video play out. It was difficult to relive those moments, but they knew it was necessary. This was more than just about them. It was about holding Roberts and the system accountable for the destruction they had caused. When it came time for Roberts to speak, his once confident demeanor was replaced by a trembling voice. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered. I thought they were dangerous. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." His excuses rang hollow in the courtroom. The judge, unimpressed by his weak defense, delivered a scathing rebuke. "Your actions were not those of someone trying to protect their community," the judge said sternly. "They were motivated by racism and hatred, and they led to the suffering of innocent people. Your false report was a direct cause of the violence that followed, and you must be held accountable." The gavel came down, and Roberts was sentenced to a prison term for filing a false report and inciting violence. His punishment was a small victory in the larger battle for justice, but it was a victory nonetheless. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted into cheers as the word of the verdict spread, and Jason and Lisa could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the fight wasn't over. The officers involved in the raid were next to face the consequences of their actions. Following Roberts' sentencing, several of the officers had already been fired, and now they were facing criminal charges for assault and abuse of power. Their defense attorneys argued that they had acted under the assumption that the wedding party posed a threat, but the video evidence showed otherwise. Their excessive use of force, their brutal treatment of women, children, and the elderly, was indefensible. As the trial unfolded, more damning details about the officers' conduct came to light. It was revealed that some of them had prior complaints of excessive force and racial profiling, complaints that had been swept under the rug by the department. This case had blown the lid off of a culture of impunity within the police force, and the public was demanding accountability. The judge in the officers' trial was not swayed by their excuses. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was clear. The officers were guilty. They were sentenced to prison terms for their role in the brutal raid, and their reputations were left in ruins. The department itself faced federal oversight, and reforms were being implemented to prevent such abuses from happening again. But the most symbolic moment came when the police chief, the man who had presided over the department during the raid, was forced to resign in disgrace. His fall from grace was a powerful reminder that no one was above the law, not even those who wielded power within the system. The changes that followed were far-reaching, with new policies put in place to ensure greater transparency and accountability within the police force. Jason and Lisa, though scarred by the events that had unfolded, had become the faces of a movement. They stood together on the steps of the courthouse after the final verdict, addressing the crowd of supporters and media who had gathered. "This isn't just about us," Jason said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "This is about everyone who has ever been brutalized, silenced, or ignored by a system that is supposed to protect them. We were lucky to have our voices heard, but there are so many others who never get that chance. We need to keep fighting, keep demanding justice, until everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Lisa spoke next, her voice steady and strong. "We've seen what happens when hatred and prejudice are allowed to fester. But we've also seen the power of community, the power of standing up for what's right. We will continue to fight, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has been wronged by this system." The crowd cheered, their voices filled with hope and determination. The fight was far from over, but the tides were turning. Jason and Lisa's story had sparked a movement, and they knew they had to continue the work to ensure that the injustices they had endured would not be repeated. As they walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand, they knew that their love, the love that had brought them together on their wedding day, had become something even more powerful. It had become a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of hope for a better future. The newlyweds, Jason and Lisa, having faced brutality and injustice, finally secured justice. The officers responsible for the attack were fired and punished, and their racist neighbor who made the false accusations was sent to prison. Their story became a symbol of how the strength of the community and the truth can triumph over even the darkest prejudices. But their journey toward justice is just the beginning of a long road to change. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories of the fight for truth and equality, and be sure to write in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps us moving forward.